Okay, okay. Thank you. Thanks for spotting that. And Alexander is from joining us from Bochum as well. Hi, Alex. How are you? Okay, very good. Okay, so everybody, I just want to welcome you all to this our first session. Today we're going to be listening to Shannon Sauro from the University of Maryland. Sina is going to introduce her in a minute. But just a reminder that you are also going to be meeting your own working groups, okay? Your own people in your own working groups this Friday afternoon, okay? And you should all be receiving a message, if you haven't received one already, from your partners in Bochum, telling you the Zoom link that you can use for your meeting, okay, this Friday, right? Because this project is all about obviously learning content, learning fresh ideas from people like Shannon and the other colleagues who have invited to talk to you, but also it comes from interacting together and sharing your own experiences and learning to work together in the future, okay? So they are the two functions, shall we say, of our project. Okay, so with that, I hand over to Sina.
Yes, so I can introduce Shannon. Shannon, thanks for being here. So as Rob already said, Shannon teaches at the University of Maryland, and she's also a researcher and focuses on virtual exchange or telecollaboration, but also on online fan practices, which she will talk about today. She is also trained teachers of English in Sweden and in the United States, and she also speaks a lot of languages. Now, I don't know if I remember correctly, Shannon, but I know that you speak German, Swedish, and I think also Japanese and a little bit of Chinese. Is that correct?
A very little bit, yeah. Very little.
So welcome, Shannon. I'd say I hand over to you. If you students or teachers have questions, please write them in the chat, or you will also have time to ask them after Shannon's presentation.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Zina, for that introduction, and thank you, Robert, for inviting me to take part in this virtual exchange, this very special virtual exchange, which I know has an in-person component at the end. So today I'm going to be talking about fan fiction and foreign language teaching. All of you will have had a chance to hopefully read the article that was shared that kind of gave an overview about broader fan practices. And here I'm actually going to share with you what happens when we bring those fan practices into the foreign language classroom. But first, I'm going to start off with why we're doing this. It might seem a little bit unusual. Why are we going to do fan stuff in teaching? And it really stems from a common challenge we language teachers often face, and that is the fact that learning a language is a difficult and time-intensive process, even when you have the best conditions. There's a lot of focus on grammar, sometimes too much focus on assessment, and all of the things that we often see in the language classroom can sometimes have a negative effect on learning, leading to apathy or boredom. This is probably something you may have seen. And this can preclude the large volume of what we know to be required for language learning, this effortful engagement to develop advanced language proficiency. But one place that we do see interesting things happening where people are putting a lot of effort into language learning is a place called the digital wilds. And these are the digital spaces, communities, and networks where language learning occurs that are independent of formal instructional context. Some of you may have experienced this yourself. I know I've encountered it in certain spaces. But within the digital wilds, there are various different communities. And the one that I'm focusing on is one that I've encountered a lot, and that is online fandom, or these are local and international networks of fans that develop around a particular program, text, or other media product. You yourself may be involved to some degree in an online fan community, maybe peripherally, maybe you like to read about your favorite sports team, or maybe there's a band that you follow, or maybe, as in my case, there was a television show that you would like to talk with other people about in. But in these fan communities, we see a lot of innovative fan practices that can lead to language learning. In fact, some fans deliberately like the thing so much that they want to learn that language. Right now, we're seeing this explosion with Korean language learning, for instance, around fans who love BTS, which is a well-known Korean pop music group. And you have a lot of international fans who are learning Korean for the purpose of understanding the lyrics better, but also kind of as a sign of respect for the band members themselves. So that's an example of something we see going on right now. And before I go further, I want to define what it means to be a fan, because this is a definition that changes a lot and not everybody identifies as a fan, but I'm using a term that comes out of the field of fan studies, which is an area of media studies that describes a fan as a person with a relatively deep, positive emotional conviction about someone or something famous. Now, full disclosure, you can see in the picture here, that's me, the shorter person. I am a fan myself, and so I bring that as a teacher to my class, but also a high degree of enthusiasm and appreciation for my students and what they like. You can also see my colleague here, Björnson Mark, who I collaborated with on the research I'm going to share with you. He's also a big fan, although not necessarily of Sherlock Holmes. He's a big fan of Lord of the Rings. In fact, he has a dog named Gimli. So those of you who are familiar with that kind of that text will recognize that's the name of a character from that. But another term for fan that I like, and is a more recent one from my friend and colleague, Lena Pettersson at the University of Copenhagen, is basically that fans are collectors of enthusiasm in the broadest sense. And so what I want to talk about is how to tap into the enthusiasm that fans have and bring it into the language classroom so that students want to spend this time learning the languages that they're either required to learn or maybe struggling to learn. We see in the digital wilds that there have been a lot of research already on fan practices for language learning. And so this is what I talked about in the 2017 article that was shared with you. I'm going to focus here in this talk only on fan fiction, but I do want to point out there's some other areas that are kind of exploding. So if you're very interested in particular, there's a lot of work actually coming out of Spain on fan translation practices and language learning. So I'm not touching on that today, but there's a rich body of research in Spanish in particular. But fan fiction, like fan, has a variety of definitions. And the definition I'm using is this one. It's that writing that continues, interrupts, reimagines, or just riffs on the stories and characters other people have already written about. So you're transforming something that already exists. You don't have to build it from new. There's an idiom that people will sometimes use. It's like playing in someone else's sandbox. So you're playing with someone else's ideas and building on them. So we've seen research that's looked at fan fiction and language learning in the digital wilds, and I wanted to share a few studies with you. So one we see is Lee from 2012, who looked at a young Hmong refugee to the United States from Thailand, who used her reading of fan fiction to later develop different kinds of writing skills. So Yin started off as a fan artist. She liked to draw to illustrate the fan fiction she was reading. So what she would do is copy the stories that she was reading. So she wasn't writing, she was copying. But then later on, she progressed to summarizing the stories. And then eventually she started writing her own fan fiction. So you could see through the reading, the scaffolding, her ability to summarize, but also write creatively, two very different kinds of texts. Another thing that we see is often fans like kind of being outside of the classroom and doing things for fun that have nothing to do with what they're required to do. But at the same time, what they end up doing mimics the skills that they need for the formal classroom. And this was the case with fans of the band One Direction. And they were all members of this fan fiction writing group who were interviewed by this pair of researchers. And again, these were young people, teenagers, and they found that certain language skills that they developed to write fan fiction actually transferred to the classroom and their academic writing. And this included, for instance, their development of their vocabulary and grammar knowledge, but also their ability to identify their own mistakes and to self-correct. This is a pretty powerful skill that they had learned writing fan fiction. Now, I focused a lot on English, but I'm going to touch a little bit on other languages here. And here's a more recent study and one that I find pretty interesting. And this looks at the use of fan fiction to support learner agency, or we might say the confidence of the learners to actually write and use the language. And this was a study carried out recently by an Iranian scholar, actually a doctoral student in Japan, who was looking at Iranian learners of Japanese and how they weren't satisfied and they didn't have confidence in their Japanese language classes that they were taking. So they ended up taking part in this fan fiction activity based on a popular Japanese anime, Kimi no Namae wa, or Your Name, which they did outside of class. And through the writing of this fan fiction, they recognized their own skills. they developed greater motivation and agency, and they recognized an increased fluency and confidence in their control over the language. They also recognized the ability to actually write in a way that was interesting and would hook readers. So these are some examples of what's going on in the digital wilds. The question is, what happens when we bring this into a classroom? So I'm going to share this research that I was alluding to about what happens when we bring fan fiction into a university classroom. And then after, I'm going to look at what happens when you bring it into a secondary classroom. So at the university level, we're going to pop on over to Sweden, to the city of Malmö in the very southern part, to a first-year required university English class for future teachers of English, maybe like some of you in here, except these are students in their very first term. Their proficiency in English was at the B2 to C1 level on the Common European Framework of Reference, and they were taking a required course on the teaching of literature and creative writing for teaching in future secondary or upper secondary schools in Sweden. And so with my colleague Björn Sundmark, we did a 6-year project where we transformed the fan fiction activities. And we started off the first 2 years by having them do something based on The Hobbit. We called it the blogging Hobbit. Then to the Sherlock Holmes stories, called A Study in Sherlock. And then the final 2 years based on student request, because we had a lot of fans of Harry Potter in the course, to the Potter Project, where we looked at Harry Potter. So these texts were selected in part because they reflected texts that the students could use to teach their future students. So we had them doing this project. And the project itself had 2 components. So these were very large classes of over 80 students. So they worked in collaborative groups. And as a group, they wrote collaborative fan fiction. So the groups were generally between 3 and 6 students, and each student was required to produce 1,000 words. So the stories ranged in length from 3,000 words to one group that was really keen, and they wrote over 16,000 words. But in addition, we had them writing an individual reflection paper. And this kind of comes out of the work of David Noonan's approach to task-based language teaching, where we use this reflection on the task. And this is what I'm going to share here, where the students actually reflected on what they learned or the choices they made through writing. So we could see how fan fiction affected their English in essence. So not surprisingly, a number of students identified the fact that in trying to transform the story and write something new, they had to stay very close to the original text and read it carefully and understand the grammar being used and try to use it the same way that the author did. And so we had some students, for instance, this is from one of the first 2 years where they were writing their story based on The Hobbit. One student was writing from the perspective of the character you see here. His name is Gollum, and he has a very particular way of speaking. And this student was trying to mimic Gollum's speech style. So we might say he has some certain kinds of grammatical errors or idiosyncrasies in his speech. And so this student had to capture that when he was writing the dialogue for this character. And we can see here, he wrote a riddle that has an element of that. It is lying still, yet it spins around. It tries to move, but its body is bound. All because of the precious it stole, fool us again, and they eats it whole. So I've highlighted that part. So the student pointed out, he really had to pay attention to capturing that style without making it too incorrect. So he had to really pay attention to language form. But what I saw most, and this is across the first 2 years in particular, the students identified the need to really develop new vocabulary that went beyond common everyday language. So one student wrote, "This writing activity has influenced my language skills. During this project, I've been able to expand my repertoire of English words, which are not so commonly used in everyday English anymore." So what this had to do with is the fact that they were writing a story based in a fantasy world. And although the students had a very high level of English proficiency, their English was really more spoken language, more modern, and they didn't have the literary language that they needed to develop to write these stories. So in writing fan fiction, they had to develop new vocabulary. So one group of students who wanted to talk about a party, they wanted to put a party in their story, but they knew that the text that they were reading didn't have words like party, drinks, and snacks. So they had to look through the text and find other words. So instead of party, they found the word feast. So that's not common everyday English, but maybe more fantasy English. Another thing that the students particularly enjoyed, and I think this benefited their attention and engagement, was they were given the opportunity of fusing or telling alternate universe stories. So they could take, by the time we got to Sherlock Holmes, they were allowed to take familiar Sherlock Holmes stories, which are based in Victorian London, and bring them to Sweden. So a lot of them did that. And they had a good time trying to figure out what these very British characters would do in the Swedish context. So you can see on the right is an example of one of the stories called The Hound of the Northern Lights, which is based on The Hound of the Baskervilles, but it's set in absolute northern Sweden in Norrland. So they had to have, what happens when Holmes and Watson encounter the bureaucracy of the Swedish police system, for instance. But we also see, for example, on the left, students situated the stories in their local context and sometimes use that to engage in critique of local issues. And we see this in a study in Brown from cohort 2016, who are actually commenting in their story on the rise of Islamophobia that we were seeing in Sweden or in Malmö shortly after the refugee crisis, where a large number of Syrians had migrated to Sweden, coming through Malmö in particular. So this story I've highlighted in orange, two of the terms that they used or concepts that they were using to kind of point to stereotypes about Sweden or things that maybe Swedish nationalists might say. Ullared is a store, a well-known Swedish store in a certain part of Sweden that people go to. So it's like a big cultural practice. But another thing here we see in the bottom, anyone who doesn't share their love of meatballs is referencing the well-known Swedish meatballs, which are made of pork, and therefore something people who are observing Islam won't be eating. So they targeted certain issues in their local context. Another group of students, and this was a large group, had a hard time initially with the text because they maybe didn't really know The Hobbit or they didn't really know Sherlock Holmes, but by being allowed to merge it with something they did know and love, they got really excited about the stories and put that time and energy in. So this was an innovative group of students who merged Sherlock Holmes with Scooby-Doo. So that is an American television show set in the 1960s. So they had a really good time. And as one student said, my interest in Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes world is still at an intermediate level. On the other hand, my knowledge of the Scooby-Doo universe is far greater, and I could enter that verse much easier than the universe of Sherlock Holmes. So that facilitated that effortful engagement that we wanted them to spend on writing by allowing them to bring in the thing that they loved. What this also led to as well is an awareness of the need to adapt their language to fit the time periods that they were writing in. So the students who chose to write their stories of Sherlock Holmes set in the original Victorian time period were faced with a unique challenge in that the English used then is different from the English used now. So one of the students reflected on the choices that they had to make. She said, the first thing that came to mind for me when considering Arthur Conan Doyle's language and how to emulate it was the time it was written in. The problem when writing the fan fiction was knowing which words were and which words were not used in Arthur Conan Doyle's time, so more than 100 years ago at this point. Thankfully, we have the internet now, and whenever my group was in doubt, we could find the answer quite easily. So what the students recognized is they knew very contemporary English, but they were writing a story that was based in a time period more than 100 years ago, and they needed to find a way to match the language of that time period. So they spent a lot of time researching the differences, kind of doing a bit of etymological research. What this meant, though, was kind of interestingly, they started to encounter a lot of new vocabulary that they didn't already use, and it broadened their language use beyond the classroom. So we had a number of students who would watch television shows based on the Sherlock Holmes stories, for instance, as a way to get them thinking and learning. And a lot of those shows were based out of Britain. So what they realized is the kind of English that they were using was heavily Americanized, and they were starting to expand their British Englishisms. So one said, first off, I'm highly Americanized in my English use, and I blame Hollywood. It's been a welcome challenge to write in British. My biggest inspiration has once again been the BBC show, Sherlock. I truly enjoyed using the word foggiest in a text, and it's now a part of my vocabulary. My American is being invaded, the British are coming. Okay, my students are pretty humorous that way, but that's just an example of how they were broadening the kind of Englishes that they were using based on the text that they were reading. So that's at the university level. The next question is, what happens when you go to slightly less motivated students like we might find in our secondary school classes? For this, I want to introduce the Fantails team. You can see some of them here dressed in their fanish gear. So FANTALES is an international team of secondary school language teachers and university researchers located in Belgium, particularly in Flanders, Germany, and Sweden, who are interested in developing teaching materials for the language classroom that were based on multilingual, interactive fan fiction. So this is pretty complicated stuff, but I'm going to share with you links at the end of this course or this talk where you can see the materials for use in teaching. And one of the things that came out of this was the need to kind of carry out a study in an actual secondary school classroom to see what happened. So for this, we head over to Belgium, to the town of Aalst, which you can see here on the middle left side of the image. This is also located in Flanders. This was at an upper secondary school, students in their final year. So they were 17 to 18 years old. The class had about 21 students. Their English level was at a slightly lower level than those that we saw in MALMÖ. So maybe at the highest, the B2. And once again, they were also organized into small collaborative teams. So 2 to 3 students per group. Unlike the students in Sweden, though, the students in Aalst were given the chance to choose which text they were going to write about, and they made a rather interesting choice. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the digital game Assassin's Creed, but that's what they chose as their text. So their text is not a traditional book, but rather we might say an action-adventure video game that has a narrative element. And what's interesting about Assassin's Creed is there are many different versions, and each version is set in a different region or historical period where the story takes place. For instance, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece, or Paris just before the French Revolution. So the students were allowed to pick one of those universes or imagine their own, but they still had to have elements of Assassin's Creed, which meant there was some assassinating going on. So maybe a little bit of violence. And the teacher had dedicated, they had a total of 25 hours of class time to write these stories. But the kind of stories they were writing had a very particular format. So they were using a tool called Twine that allows them to tell these interactive stories. And I'll show you an example of one here on this next slide. So this is from a group of women, or girls, I should say, who are really into pirates. And you could see they wrote a story where they were really interested in pirates who were women. So they did a lot of research about actual historical women pirates and set their story in this context. And they brought in a few other things like elements from Pirates of the Caribbean, for instance. What you can see here is the top part in white is part of their story as they're narrating it. And then you get down to the blue parts. These are 2 choices. This is the interactive choice. So as a reader, you have to make a choice. Choice 1, attack them and risk the chance that Mary and her crew might die. And if you choose that, the story goes in one direction, or turn the ship the other way and the story goes in another direction. So this is an example of interactive fan fiction that they were doing. So altogether, there were a number of stories that came out of this. And when we interviewed the students, so they didn't write reflections, but we interviewed them, we wanted to see what it was they saw that they had learned and kind of how this mapped onto what we saw at the university level. Not surprisingly, a lot of them pointed out to the fact that this was particularly challenging but helpful because it helped them develop their creativity and their vocabulary in English. So again, vocabulary is a useful theme that we see here. So the students had not had experience prior to this writing creatively in English, or in fact, any of the other languages they used at their school, like French. And so they observed that initially it was pretty difficult to come over and do that. But they found that once they started, they were able to be creative and use the extensive vocabulary that's required in storytelling, and which is different than they might do in other kinds of academic writing. So others spoke generally and saw that this amount of writing that they had to do and writing the stories and having kind of branching stories with these multiple choices improved their writing skills. So first off, it improved their writing skills because they'd never had to write such a long text in English previously, and now they had to, but they had to make sure the different parts of the stories fit together. But on top of that, they pointed to the fact that they had to use more descriptive language. So they were building up their vocabulary and their way of like describing characters, describing setting, something that they weren't usually doing in any of their other writing. So they found that particularly helpful for all of their writing skills. And perhaps my favorite comment from the students has to do with a pretty astute observation and something that we see that may be unique to this kind of creative writing. And that was paying attention to sentence variety in order to be interesting. So one student said, I think that with the English, we had to pay attention to the structure of the sentences because it was very tempting to start every sentence with he. He did this, he did that, and then continue like that, or just make very short sentences instead of kind of trying to build a decent, beautiful sentence that you would actually read in a book. So part of the challenge that the students had is because they were sharing their stories with their classmates so they could play it on these twine games, they wanted to make sure the stories weren't boring. And they realized that these common sentence structures, the very repetitive basic sentence structures that they were used to using, were really boring to read. So they had to vary the sentence structures because they actually wanted to be interesting. So that was kind of a really great success in generating this interest in sentence variety. All right, I'm going to come to some concluding observations, and one of them has to do with language. In particular, the language I'm talking about here. I've emphasized almost entirely through this talk fan fiction for the teaching of English, but there are many other languages that we can teach through fan fiction. And I want to point you in the direction of some recent research that's come out by Brunel in 2021, who looked at the use of fan fiction tasks in a French middle school classroom. So now we're looking at even younger learners. And she used it not only to support the development of their literacy and digital skills, but also to increase students' interest in classic literary works, like the one here that we see, Le Collier Rouge, by bridging classical texts with kind of these pop cultural practices. So it was a way of getting these young people very interested in texts that they were required to read and might not otherwise have been as excited about. So this is a publication in French. And finally, to bring it back to Fantales and to some of the questions that I've shared with you that you'll be discussing in your groups this week, I believe. Fantales generated a lot of materials that are now available freely for language teachers. So if you would like to know more, and if you're kind of curious and looking at teaching materials you might use in a future class, they've generated storytelling prompts, including fan fiction prompts for Dutch, English, German, and Swedish, which are all the languages of the project. So I focused here in particular on English. That was the test language, but we then generated materials and used them in particular in Swedish as a second language or Dutch as a second language classes. You can also find other teaching materials on the Fantales website, including assessment tools. That's a big question we didn't talk about today, like how do you evaluate fan fiction? And other things for training students, including modifying fan fiction activities for learners with different learning needs or different levels of proficiency. So you'll see today, I was talking about pretty high level learners, but not all of us are working with students at that level. And the question is, can you do fan fiction with lower proficiency learners? I want to say that Brunel's study that we just saw is a clear example of yes. And we anticipated this in the materials. There's a teacher handbook that's also available on this Fantales website. So I think with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation and stop sharing. And I think this is the time to take questions, correct?
Thank you very much, Shannon. Yes, indeed. Well done. Thank you very much. It was an excellent talk. Thank you very much indeed for that. I don't know, Sina, do you want to start off with the questions and answers to find out if anybody wants to participate?
Yes, of course. But first of all, thank you, Shannon. That was very, very insightful and such a fascinating topic. I wish I had known this before my teacher training. But yeah, sure. So now is your chance to ask questions. You can either post them in the chat, or you might as well, just unmute yourself or raise your hand so you can ask Shannon directly. Yeah, so but until anyone asks a question, I do actually
maybe raise your hand, people. If anybody wants to speak, but you can raise your hand, or if not, type it in. So then we'll see who wants to kind of have a queue of questions.
Exactly. Yeah. But until then, I do have a question, Shannon, and I cannot see any raised hands. So do you ever, or would you say, I thought about that last week because I thought about J.K. Rowling again, and would you say it's also necessary to talk to students about, the author itself, or how much can you actually, separate the author from their work, and how would you discuss that in a language learning classroom?
Okay, I'm really glad you mentioned that question, because I'm going to name the elephant in the room. J.K. Rowling has come out very much with extremely transphobic rhetoric. So she has made statements that have really gone against trans rights. And as a fan in the Harry Potter fandom, I've seen what's happened to those fans. So it's been very alienating. And when I bring Harry Potter into my classes, so again, what I'm sharing with you are things that I did with the students with Harry Potter in 2017 and 2018. So I don't use Harry Potter so much in my classes now for several reasons. And one of them is millennials really like Harry Potter, but what we're seeing are more of the younger students coming through who weren't as attached to it. So there's a difference in what people want to see. But if I'm going to bring a text into the course that has issues around it, I make it very clear what position I'm taking. So when I've used Harry Potter, I point out what I'm using in the course is often fan works, not necessarily focusing on J.K. Rowling's positions, but on the creations of fans. And I may sometimes share trans-oriented texts, because what you'll often see is, this is a common fan practice, it's called gender bending, where people will change the gender of the characters as a way to kind of explore what would happen in the story. That's a very common fan fiction trope. So when it comes to Rowling, I have an explicit disclaimer in the text, because I have had, in fact, since coming here to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, trans students in my classes. And so I am mindful of how that could be perceived by them. And so it's possible, you can't have a perfect creator or a perfect text, but I think it's helpful to be thoughtful about what it is you're sharing with the students and how they may interpret that, what it is you're advocating for, and who it may be alienating. And I want to back up a bit. I'm mentioning Rowling, but all of the texts that I use, we have deep problems with all of those authors. And sometimes they are superficial, but the very first text that we used, The Hobbit, was a problem for many of our students because it has almost no female characters in it. So it's a universe in which women are invisible or irrelevant. And this really violates the norms of the Swedish education system. And it was disheartening for our students who identified as women or who really wanted a more gender equal text that we use that. And so we took that under advisement and did not use it. That's why we shifted. But there's still the problem that all three of the texts that I'm featuring here place prominence on heroes or main characters who are British men. So we're centering masculinity. So that was still a problem.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Shannon, for that answer. That's actually
was
a good idea.
Was Aragorn a British man as well, was he? Okay.
Stand-in.
Yeah, okay, yeah. He probably had an English accent in the film.
Definitely.
Right? Yeah. Okay, Miriam, if I'm pronouncing your name properly, you have a hand up, and then we'll come to Timo and then Aoife.
Yeah, thank you. Hello. So my question was about the study you conducted at the University of Sweden. You mentioned that a group tried to capture the style of a novel, but they didn't pay attention to the correct use of English. So how do you reconcile that, using an authentic style of the novel, but also not paying attention to grammar? Because as a teacher, we also have to assist students. So I find it a little bit contradictory to have both dimensions.
Okay, I want to clarify. They did pay attention to grammar. They were trying to match the grammar of the original text. So if a character is speaking a kind of English that's ungrammatical, they wanted to capture that character's speech style. But in the rest of their writing, they were very accurate. In fact, having them in these teams helped them. There was like an implicit form of peer feedback. And we also I do want to point out, yeah, you are absolutely correct that we want to support accuracy. So if you look at the FANTALES website, one of the things we have in there are different rubrics for evaluating the fan fiction. And we included kind of a broad statement about language accuracy as well. So that is something we considered.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Next, if
Please,
I may.
yes, Timo. Yes.
Okay, I have my question is not yet super clear to me, but I'm sort of like a qualitative research type person, and but so I hate that I'm asking this, but in the course of your research and in this field, have we found that kind of this focus on or this means of motivating students to learn via fan type practices is in some way quantitatively different than other non-fan practices?
Okay, I don't know of a study that's done that, but I can tell you about a really cool study out of Norway that was looking at high school students and their outside of class learning. And this is by Lisbeth Breivik and colleagues. And she noticed there's a subpopulation, this was very interesting, a subpopulation of Norwegian youth who did better on the Norwegian national exams on the English version than in the Norwegian version. So their English, their written English, was actually stronger than the Norwegian. And this seemed like some weird anomaly. And based on, again, she had quantitative data, but then she had to interview these populations. And what she found were different populations that performed in this level. She had the gamers, she had what's referred to as the social media users, and the surfers. And I would say in those groups, we see a lot of the fans. And what we found is the amount of time that they spend doing these things in English was why their English was better than their Norwegian. But the best group tended to be the gamers, but they tended to spend a lot more time gaming in English than any of the other groups. So we're also seeing this time spent on it. So that's the closest that I know of.
Thanks.
Okay, I wanted to go to Aoife's text question first, and then we'll come back to the others in the queue. Okay, Aoife says, how would you set student boundaries regarding topics relating to fan fiction or work hard conversations surrounding / fiction?
Okay.
Or make sure topics are suitable. Okay, so basically, how, where do you set boundaries for what you allow students to write about and what not, etc., etc.
This is a good question, and it's one that the FANTALES team came up with. So I'm going to mention sex in particular, because that was a difference that we saw between what was allowed in Sweden versus our colleagues in Flanders. So the schools in Flanders tended to be more Catholic based, and they had more restrictions on the topics that were considered appropriate for the school. Within Sweden, stories that have a sexual content are not forbidden, and in fact, at this age group are considered normal. So, but at the same time, what you don't want might be like overt expressions of racism. So every society and every school system has values and norms that you want to promote in the classroom and other things that you consider off limits in the classroom. What we found, of course, was coming up with explicit instructions. And you'll notice if you look at the FANTALES materials, there are different prompts that you can use about the kinds of fan fiction that you can tell. So I mentioned the gender bending, but you might also have another very popular type of fan fiction, which is called alternate point of view, where you retell a scene from a character's different point of view. When you retell that scene, there really isn't room for sexuality in it, right? Because what you're trying to do is do character analysis of that scene. So what we would have the teachers do, or what the teachers would come up with, what kind of guidance and what kind of models they would provide with the students, and how explicit in the directions they would say, this is what you can write about, or this is what you can't. And we didn't have a situation where people wrote something they were not allowed to do. There's also something I do as well, which is ask students to share an outline of what they plan to do that I approve first before they do the writing. So they have to do some planning in advance. And that way, if I see something that may pose a challenge or be not classroom appropriate, I can help redirect the student to something else. Because you're right, this is a good question. In fan spaces, in the digital wilds, people write about a lot of things that we wouldn't want in a classroom.
But you're just saying that it's very important to keep the teacher involved in all of this at all times, right? To see what's happening. Yeah. Okay. We're going to go now to Niraj. I'm not too sure how to pronounce your name. Apologies.
Yeah, no problem. So my question is related to something I came up with while reading the article, and specifically something I've heard about people who really engage with anime and manga, is that sometimes people internalize maybe more misogynistic or homophobic views, which can come out, or they have a view of particular cultures to be a certain way. And when they actually visit those cultures, they behave in ways which many people could find disrespectful to the actual culture themselves. So it's kind of related to what you just answered as well. But I was just wondering how that can play out in fan fiction or engaging with this type of media.
I think there's I'm going to tell a side story and then bring it back. There's a scholar named Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is an African-American scholar. She has a terrific book that looks at fan fiction called The Dark Fantastic. But she looks at the fact that there tends to be a lack of imagination in a lot of the mainstream texts. She's focusing in particular on the US context, but we can see this in other places where certain stories get told and certain stereotypes about minority populations are perpetuated. And we can also see this, unfortunately, replicated in fan fiction, where people may take a very, I guess we could say, colonialist view, or a very patronizing view if they try to write about something that they're not a part of or not knowledgeable of. And so you can have that emerge in your classes. One of our teachers in Sweden was trying to do something like that with her students, where they were exploring a text from, I think it was called the Diary of the Part-Time Indian. So they were looking at a Native American perspective. And as you know, in the United States, Native Americans have been heavily, not just, well, genocide has been carried out about them. They're in a very disadvantaged position. They're heavily marginalized. And so texts that are written by people from that community can be very powerful tools of empathy and understanding, but it can also be a way for people to, unfortunately, replicate those stereotypes. So she worked hard to bring in multiple voices. And in addition to the fan fiction that they were writing, they were like listening to YouTube videos or TED Talks talking about potential problems around the co-opting of these stories. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I want to say that is a really good one, because the stories that we read do very much replicate power structures surround us, and then the stories we tell back can do the same.
Okay, you're very popular, Shannon. You're provoking lots of questions and lots of comments. Are you okay for another few minutes?
I am, if people don't mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. First we go to Jordan, and then we'll come to another couple of questions in the chat as well by Meg and Jose Maria. Jordan, you want me to say it, or it's not working, right? So I'll read out. Okay, so I'll skip. So you can put it into the chat, right? Meg Dale, do you want to turn on your mic, or do you want me to read it out?
I can
Great.
say it.
Thank you, Meg.
This question came up while you were talking about the J.K. Rowling situation, and I was just wondering, because I have no experience with this with students, if the writing of fan fiction could be almost like a restorative or healing process. For example, if they're like a trans student and they really love Harry Potter, like would the process of rewriting Harry Potter stories like be restorative for them, or in your experience would it more likely be like triggering and like re-traumatizing?
I think that's such a good question, and it's something I'm trying to balance, because we do see fans in the Harry Potter community who are doing exactly that, where they are reclaiming the text, or they're pointing to things in the text that align with trans representation. So for instance, there's a certain potion that you can take that changes you into another character. And this actually happens where, for instance, Hermione takes it and now she looks like Harry. So in a sense, she's become male. Everything about her is male. And so people will explore that in the text as a restorative attempt. We also have fans who are, you may have heard that there are many cast members associated with the Harry Potter films who have also come out directly and made statements in support of trans rights. And, despite sharing their appreciation for the work of Rowling, wanting people to have this broader view. So you can see that creative writing can be a way of talking back to the power, to being a transformative tool and a way to write yourself into a text. And it can have a healing purpose, but it can also be the case individually, right? It's going to depend so much on the student themselves, the history they bring to the text, and maybe how they've been affected by it. So when I use the Harry Potter text, it's like I include in my syllabus a statement in support of trans rights, but I also point out that I am focusing on fan works. And so I use fan fiction examples that reflect those norms that I want to suggest in my students. And there's so much Harry Potter fan fiction, it's possible to do that. So it can be restorative. I haven't had a challenge yet where it has triggered a student, but that doesn't mean I won't. And when I face that, I will adapt the text. So I allow a lot of flexibility. In fact, right now, what I'm doing in Maryland is I don't require a text. I allow the students to select their own, but these are, again, university teachers. So they're like you, they're becoming language teachers. And I want them to select a text that is either meaningful to them or meaningful to their future students and try to write from that. So that is another option that I allow for.
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of people are worried about. I mean, what happens when, how do you choose a text that all your students are going to identify with or understand and things like that? That's a big issue, isn't it? Anyway, I want to come to Jose Maria. He's here with me in the room, but he's going to turn on his mic, I think. Say hello.
Hello, do you hear me all? Okay, thank you very much for this talk. It was very, very good. I had one question. Would it be possible to implement this kind of practices with students with special needs? Has it been already done, an experiment regarding to this? I think it is something concerning because we need to include them as well. And maybe they don't have the reading skills like the rest of the students. So I think it is one big concern for many of us. And also, you kind of answered before, but I wanted to know if there have been experiments actually before and after the fandom practices in terms of marks. So if students actually improve their marks after and before the intervention, or maybe marks or English level tests, official English level tests.
Okay, two really good questions. So the first one about students with special needs. The FANTALES teacher handbook has some guidelines because there are some students, for instance, who need more concrete examples or more explicit scaffolding. But we had not carried out research on that in particular. So I would say that's a rich area. If any of you are doing a thesis and you want to try fan fiction with a special learner population, that is an area that it's wide open. Please feel free to try something in that. I would love to see what happens. The next thing regarding this pre-test, post-test design, I do not know of studies that have happened that way. That would also be another great master's thesis study. I know some other people who are interested in looking at that. What they may be looking at, though, is more like holistic grading of writing ability, less about a pre-test or a post-test. But if you have a lot of control over the students and you can be, so the fan fiction I shared with you, we couldn't give students a pre-test of the vocabulary, for instance, that they would encounter because we didn't know who was going to enroll in our class until the class started. So we didn't have time to create a pre-test, but other classes may be designed that way. And I think that is something we would like to see research happening on that takes this kind of more, I guess, quantitative or quasi-experimental research.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so people are getting ideas for maybe a master's thesis as well, which is very good. Well done. That's a great idea, Shannon. Okay, we're running out of time, but I can see we have two hands still up, Mika and Darja. Okay, two very short ones, and then we'll have to finish up, I'm afraid. So Mika.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a thought. So how could these kind of fan fiction writing assessments succeed when done in bigger groups versus like doing these kind of writing tasks individually? Because when I think about it, like fandom in itself is very personal, and so picking a topic from this like kind of big pool of topics isn't actually the same as choosing your most loved movie or game or so on. So in that sense, could the fanfiction writing assessment be more productive and more effective when done like individually? Thanks.
Yes, no, you make a good point. Our students in Sweden were in these collaborative groups in part because the sheer number and how much grading we would have had. So 80 students writing separate stories, and it would have been overwhelming. So we had I guess we might say, a strategic decision that was based on a very large class. In smaller classes where you don't have as many, I think you can definitely do more individual writing, and that's what I'm doing here in Maryland. My students have the choice of collaborating or writing individually, but I don't have such large classes. And we do see when they do work in groups, there can be a lot of conflict because people have very committed ideas, especially if they like something a lot, they're often very dedicated to one interpretation, and there can be disagreement in the group. At the same time, what has been helpful is we've noticed in the past is you'll have students, some who are more confident in their writing, some who are more confident in their grammar, and the collaborative nature allows them to kind of share their expertise and support each other. And so some students felt they could not have written creatively by themselves because they didn't know where to start. So having a group member helped them overcome their own personal fears of the process. But it can make it harder to evaluate. And that's why we have this reflection paper that is a part of the assignment. And that is where they document the choices they made and what they learned. And so we can look at that to evaluate that, because it is hard to evaluate individual contributions to a story where all your writing is commingled.
Okay, very quickly, Shannon. Jordan, who's here in my class as well, he says that because manga and anime have become so popular on Netflix recently, has that led to an increase in the number of Japanese people studying Japanese as a second language? I wonder if you don't know anything about that.
Well, I would say that's been true since the late 90s. So anime and manga have been very popular for a long time. And you'll notice that one of the publications I cited, or maybe some that I didn't cite, that go back to the early 2000s have looked at fan practices around anime and manga. So I would say they definitely have an influence. And what we're also seeing is they're very popular. Like, remember the research I was talking about, fan translation in Spain? We're seeing a lot of translation from Japanese to English to Spanish to Catalan of anime and manga. So that is something that is pretty big in Spain. So not fan fiction as much as the fan translation. So that we're seeing in the Spanish language context in particular, and Catalan.
Thank you very much for all of those questions. I'm delighted to see so many people putting up your hands and talking and stuff. That's what these sessions should be about. Shannon has given us some discussion questions as well for your meeting this Friday. Okay, so it's in your worksheet, right? The worksheet that you've all got in front of you. If you look at stage 3, that's what you've got to talk about this Friday together, right? And some of the questions there have been given to us by Shannon to kind of guide your discussions there a little bit as well. Okay. So, Sina, anything else? Well, first of all, I should stop recording, right? That's the first thing. Yeah. Okay.